With only 2 weeks left in the regular season after the conclusion of week 16, things are really starting to heat up in the NFL. A number of teams are still fighting for the playoffs and for their divisions, and things are going to get really intense. So let's break it all down here. This is the Sports Ball Network, and this is our week 16 NFL breakdown. Thursday night kicked off the week with a pivotal battle for the playoffs in terms of the wild card as well as the NFC South as the Los Angeles Rams took on the New Orleans Saints. It was the now 8-7 Rams who won this one 30-22. And don't be deceived by the score. This game was not that close. For the Rams, they suddenly look like a team that nobody wants to play. Quarterback Matthew Stafford's been lights out as of late. And that continued into this game as the potential future Hall of Famer threw for 328 yards and 2 touchdowns on 24 out of 34 passing. The main beneficiary of this lights out performance was, of course, wide receiver Puka Nakua, who caught 9 of 11 targets for 164 yards and a touchdown, as well as adding 2 carries for 16 yards on the ground. Puka has made history. He is one of only a few rookies to have at least 4 games over 140 yards. He's just been lights out this year. This Rams team really has been getting a lot of contributions from a lot of the younger players. For example, running back Kyron Williams in his second year also had a big night. 22 carries, 104 yards, and a touchdown on the ground. He's also been really growing into his own. The defense has seen a lot of young contributors step up alongside veterans such as Aaron Donald. And hey, this Rams team is dangerous and they are playing good football at the right time. And if I were a team like, let's say, the Eagles or the Cowboys that win the NFC East, would I want to face this Rams team? Probably not. Meanwhile, for the New Orleans Saints, they fell to 7-8. They're now a game back of Tampa Bay for the division. They're a game back for the wild card based on tiebreakers. And this was a game that they could not afford to lose, but they just didn't have enough. Quarterback Derek Carr had good counting stats: 319 yards, 3 touchdowns, a 2 point conversion, and an interception in the air. But he was off all night. He was really inconsistent. Routinely missing open throws, just not a good game from him. Most of those numbers came late in the fourth when things were well out of hand. Running back Alvin Kamara struggled: 19 yards on the ground, 16 in the air on 5 receptions. Just he had a bad game. Los Angeles was keying in on him all game, knowing that if they stopped him, they stopped the Saints. Look to see him bounce back next week in a pivotal matchup against the Bucs. And the defense struggled as well. They only had a single sack, was not able to generate anything. But hey, it wasn't all bad for New Orleans. Chris Olave had a great game coming back from his injury: 9 receptions, 123 yards, converting on that 2 point conversion. Rashid Shaheed also had a very good game: 5 receptions, 70 yards, a touchdown. So the New Orleans wide receiver corps was able to get something going, and hopefully they carry that momentum into next week in a game against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers that could very well decide the fate of the NFC South. We got some more Saturday football this week as the Pittsburgh Steelers ended up beating the Cincinnati Bengals to kick things off in the afternoon, 34-11. Let's talk about the Bengals first. The Bengals fall to 8-7, and their playoff hopes are firmly on life support right now. Quarterback Jake Browning, 335 yards, a touchdown, a 2 point conversion, but 3 costly interceptions. Joe Mixon was only able to get 43 yards on the ground and 7 in the air. Wide receiver T. Higgins was shut down for most of the game, save for a third quarter, which ended up giving him a total stat line of 5 receptions for 140 yards and a touchdown. Uh, Really, no one else on the Cincinnati offense was really able to generate anything. The defense, only a single sack. just a terrible game for Cincinnati and a terrible game for their playoff hopes. They are now way behind a few of these teams in a stacked AFC. They've fallen to ninth, dropping out of the playoffs as of now. And with an upcoming matchup against the Chiefs, followed by the Browns, I would not be surprised if this team ends up with an 8-10 record and, unfortunately for them, eliminated from the playoffs. The Pittsburgh Steelers, meanwhile, are now 8-7 as Mike Tomlin's quest to secure another winning season continues. Quarterback Mason Rudolph filling in for the injured Kenny Pickett threw for 290 yards and 2 touchdowns. He was okay for most of the game. He did what he needed to do. Najee Harris, 78 yards and a touchdown on the ground. George Pickens had a great game, 4 receptions for 195 yards and 2 touchdowns. He really needed that after he was getting a lot of scrutiny for his performance over the past few weeks, as well as his general lack of effort. Nobody else on the Pittsburgh offense was really able to do anything. The defense, 3 interceptions, 3 sacks, just terrorized Jake Browning in the backfield all game long. And if Pittsburgh is going to continue Mike Tomlin's streak of wins and potentially even make the playoffs, their best chance to get ahead comes this upcoming Sunday against the Seattle Seahawks. Because afterwards, they played the Baltimore Ravens, and depending on if the Ravens are locked up for the number one seed in the division, they could be facing a tough battle there. The Buffalo Bills moved into the AFC's sixth seed with their 24-22 victory over the Los Angeles Chargers on Saturday night. For Buffalo, this win was very important to have, and a lot of their top players ended up contributing to it. Josh Allen, 237 yards, a touchdown, and an interception, as well as 2 touchdowns on the ground. James Cook, 70 yards on the ground. He did have a fumble, though, but still very good performance from him. Gabe Davis, 4 receptions, 130 yards, a touchdown. The defense had 5 sacks. The only real noticeable players on Buffalo that did not contribute to this win were Stephon Diggs, who had 5 receptions for 29 yards, and rookie tight end Dalton Kincaid, who had a single reception for 7 yards. And if Buffalo wants to still win their division, which they technically can do if Miami loses their next 2 games and if they take care of business against the Patriots and this Dolphins team, Buffalo's going to need more out of players like Diggs and Kincaid, who earlier in the season were amazing contributors and absolutely are still elite top level players at their position. Still, at this point, it's hard to see Buffalo falling out of the playoff picture. They do have that game against New England, which they likely will win. And then Miami, though a tougher team, has traditionally been a game as of late that Buffalo ends up taking as well. So who knows? Maybe we see Buffalo win the AFC East. But at the very least, I fully expect them to be in the playoffs after the season ends. For the Chargers, this was their first game without much maligned head coach Brandon Staley, who was fired last week after their embarrassing loss against the Raiders. And the team played tough. Easton Stick, 215 yards through the air. He also had 25 yards and a touchdown on the ground. Austin Eckler ran for 65 yards and caught 3 receptions for 21 more. Joshua Palmer filling in as the top wide receiver for the injured Keenan Allen had 5 receptions for 47 yards. Gerald Everett at the tight end position, 7 receptions for 42 yards. The defense, an interception, a sack, but it wasn't enough. And this Chargers team is at this point looking towards 2024, looking towards getting a fresh start. And with the level of talent still on this roster and Justin Herbert potentially coming back healthy, I expect this team to be right back in the AFC playoff fight next year. Sunday's games on Christmas Eve kicked off with a surprising outcome as the Atlanta Falcons ended up beating the Indianapolis Colts 29-10. Let's talk about the Falcons first. Taylor Heineke at quarterback threw for 229 yards and a touchdown. Bijan Robinson, 12 carries, 72 yards, 7 receptions on 10 targets for 50 yards. Drake London, however, still underutilized, 3 receptions for 39 yards on 4 targets. Kyle Pitts also saw 4 targets, also had 3 receptions for 49 yards and a touchdown. The defense, an interception, 6 sacks. And really, it's because of this defense that Coach Arthur Smith might be going into 2024 as the head coach. The Falcons' defense this year has been pretty good, all things considered. And really, it's this unit that is the reason why this team is 7-8 and still technically alive for the division. I mentioned Coach Arthur Smith. Let's talk about him for a second. Uh, the Falcons had rumors swirling around them last week after their embarrassing loss that Arthur Smith and GM Terry Fontenot could potentially be fired if the team did not respond properly. And after this week, the rumors are now that the two will be retained through 2024. At this point, all I'll say is this. If you're having this many questions about your coach and your GM on a team that by all means should be running away with this division, then that just tells me everything you need to know about the coach and the GM. But I'm not the decision maker for the Atlanta Falcons, and it's not my call at the end of the day. So what they do is their business. That being said, this team is incredibly frustrating to watch and has been all season. And if they do keep Arthur Smith as the head coach, I imagine that's going to continue well into next year. As for the Colts, this loss was pretty bad in terms of their playoff positioning. They're now 7th in the AFC, so technically they are still that final wildcard spot. And that's in large part because a lot of the teams in the AFC that they needed to lose did end up losing this week, especially in their division where the Jaguars and the Texans, more on them later, both lost. So Indianapolis is still in a three-way tie for first place in the AFC South. Gardner Minshew, 201 yards and an interception in this game. He was not at his best. Jonathan Taylor, coming back from that thumb injury, had 43 yards and a touchdown on the ground. Josh Downs filling in for the injured Michael Pittman, who ended up sitting this game out, had 6 receptions for 39 yards. Kylan Granson had a great game at the tight end position, 5 receptions, 62 yards. He's been pretty good as of late. The defense, only a single sack, allowed 29 points to this inconsistent Falcons offense. And for Indianapolis, this game kind of shows that they really need to continue to brush up on a couple of these things if they want to win their division or if they want to make the playoffs as a wildcard team. But still, it's encouraging for them that a lot of things that they needed to go right did. It's good for this team that they're still in the playoff hunt, even with all the injuries they sustained, particularly with rookie quarterback Anthony Richardson. And I can still see this team not only making the playoffs, but potentially winning their division as well. So for the Indianapolis Colts right now, the jury is still out, and only time will tell what their 2023 season will end up being. There were a number of surprising outcomes in this week's game, but perhaps the most surprising thing happened in a game that finished the way everybody expected. The Green Bay Packers did end up beating the Carolina Panthers, improving to 7-8 on the season. But more surprising to me is that the Carolina Panthers managed to score more than 20 points in this game. In fact, they managed to score 30 in a very close 33-30 loss. in a game that has to be very encouraging for Panthers fans and for their future. Bryce Young finally showed everybody why he was the number one overall pick, throwing for 312 yards and 2 touchdowns. Chuba Hubbard contributed on the ground as well, 43 yards and a touchdown on 16 carries. DJ Chark, 6 receptions, 98 yards and 2 touchdowns. Adam Thielen, 6 receptions, 94 yards. Tommy Tremble at the tight end position, 4 receptions, 59 yards. The defense, though, did not do enough to help the offense win this game. Only a single sack against Green Bay. But still, the fact that the Panthers showed that they were able to do something like this has to be encouraging. And more importantly for this team, it showed that Bryce Young may have something in him after all. There was a lot of conversation about Bryce Young this season, mostly negative. A lot of people were asking if he was already a bust, if perhaps he would be the biggest quarterback bust in quite some time. But it's games like this that show that perhaps people were giving up on him too soon. And with a little bit of a better supporting cast, a little bit of a better coaching staff, and some time, Bryce Young could very well turn things around here in Carolina. For the Packers, no need to talk about their defensive performance. It was pretty bad. Only 2 sacks. Really, the fact that they let a Carolina Panthers team who quite literally has not been able to score more than points since their bye week, score 30 on them, should tell you everything that you need to know. For the offense, Jordan Love, 219 yards, 2 touchdowns in the air, 12 yards and a touchdown on the ground. Jordan Love, he's had a little bit of inconsistency this season, but for the most part, he's been fantastic. Aaron Jones, 21 carries, 127 yards. He had a really good game. Romeo Dobbs, 4 receptions, 79 yards, and a touchdown. Tucker Kraft at the tight end position, 4 receptions, 60 yards. But yeah, this was a win that Green Bay needed to get to stay alive in the NFC playoff race. They're still a game back of Seattle for that final wild card spot, but they are still very much alive for the wild card. And over the next 2 weeks, if they want to make the playoffs, they're going to need a little bit of help. But that being said, they still very well could do it, considering that they play the Minnesota Vikings and the Chicago Bears over these final 2 weeks, two very winnable games. So if things go right here, we could potentially be seeing a 9-8 Packers team sneaking in the playoffs with that final wild card spot. There are 3 teams in the AFC still alive for the number one overall seed and the bye. The Miami Dolphins, the Baltimore Ravens, and the Cleveland Browns, who ended up destroying the Houston Texans 36-22. And don't be mistaken by the final score. This game was like 36-7 for most of the second half. The Browns just dominated Houston all game long. Joe Flacco continues his inspiring play, 368 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 2-point conversion through the air. He did have 2 interceptions, but hey, he's a gunslinger and he does not play without taking risks. Kareem Hunt, touchdown on the ground. Jerome Ford had a touchdown on the ground as well. Amari Cooper had an insane performance, 11 receptions, 265 yards, and 2 touchdowns, as well as a 2-point conversion. Just absolutely ridiculous. If you had him for fantasy football, congratulations on moving to the championship round. David Njoku, 6 receptions, 44 yards, and a touchdown. The defense, 2 interceptions, 3 sacks. Like I said before, they pretty much held Houston to only 7 points up until late in the fourth quarter, which at that point, the game was already done. This Browns team is ridiculously good. They still have a great chance to potentially win their division, considering that Baltimore at 12-3 plays the Dolphins, which is not an easy game. And then they play the Steelers, and the Steelers and the Ravens, obviously, they play each other tough every single game. It's a divisional game, anything can happen. And in that case, if Baltimore loses out and Cleveland wins out, it's Cleveland who takes the AFC North. Uh, and if Miami ends up beating Baltimore and losing to the Bills, then it's Cleveland who wins the number one seed in the entire conference. So Browns still got a lot to play for, and they really are just a great team, fun to watch every week. Uh, Looking forward to seeing them and how far they can go after the regular season ends. For Houston, this loss was probably to be expected. This Browns team is really good, but still it hurts. Doesn't hurt as much as it could, considering their AFC South opponents also lost this week, and the teams ahead of Houston in the playoff race, for the most part, also lost. So, in the grand scheme of things, it's not really that impactful for Houston's playoff chances. Uh, Case Keenum started the game. He had 62 yards and 2 interceptions before he was pulled in garbage time for Davis Mills, who had 149 yards, 2 touchdowns, and a 2-point conversion through the air. This Houston team is really hoping CJ Stroud comes back next week, and by all indications, it seems like he will be able to. Devin Singletary struggled on the ground, 44 yards. He did have 3 receptions for 19 yards. Damian Pierce, notably, has been relegated to kickoff and punting return duties. He did have 1 return for a touchdown. It was very exciting. Rico Paul, in his return from a hamstring injury, was not able to get much going through the air. 4 receptions, 18 yards, a touchdown, and that 2-point conversion reception. Noah Brown, 3 receptions, 38 yards. Dalton Schultz, 8 receptions, 61 yards. Decent game from him. Defense, 2 interceptions, sack, but ultimately were unable to stop Cleveland all day long. For Houston, this game was bad to lose, but with an upcoming schedule with the Tennessee Titans and the Colts in their final 2 games, they could very well not only make the playoffs, but if things break right, win the AFC South and host a playoff game in this year. I can now say that I've seen the Detroit Lions do something I've never seen them do before in my life: win the NFC North. That's right, everybody. The drought, the 30-year division title drought the Lions had, it's over. The Lions beat the Minnesota Vikings 30-24 this past Sunday, clinching the NFC North. The last time Detroit won the division was in 1993 when it was the NFC Central, and the Buccaneers were still in the division then. And before today, the Buccaneers had won the division the Lions were in more recently than Detroit had, but no longer. Now Detroit is guaranteed to host a playoff game, and if things go right for them, San Francisco and the Eagles slip, the NFC will go through the Motor City. The Lions had a great performance by quarterback Jared Goff in this game: 257 yards and a touchdown. Running back Jahmyr Gibbs, 80 yards, 2 touchdowns on the ground, 4 receptions, 20 yards. David Montgomery also added him 55 yards and a touchdown. Amon-Ra St. Brown was amazing once again: 12 receptions, 106 yards, and a touchdown. Jameson Williams continues to grow in this offense: 5 receptions, 43 yards. Tight end Sam Laporta, though, strangely struggled after his huge game the week before. 3 receptions, 18 yards. The defense, 4 interceptions, 4 sacks. Just what a team effort. What a win for Detroit. And can't help but be very, very happy for them and their fans because they absolutely deserve it. The Minnesota Vikings fall to 7-8. They are currently out of the NFC playoffs as of today. Nick Mullins, 410 yards, 2 touchdowns, but 4 interceptions. Not a great game from him. Ty Chandler, following up his big week, only had 17 yards and a touchdown on the ground on 8 carries. Look to see a rebound from him next week against the Packers. Justin Jefferson, though, 6 receptions, 141 yards, and a touchdown. KJ Osborne, 5 receptions, 95 yards, and a touchdown. Both of them had fantastic games. TJ Hawkinson, 4 receptions, 58 yards. But unfortunately for him, he is out for the year with a torn ACL. Speedy recovery to him. The defense, a sack, field goal block. But in the end, Minnesota was not as good as Detroit. And now they're going to have to compete for the wild card spots in the NFC if they have any hopes or aspirations to make the playoffs and make some noise this season. The New York Jets leaned on star running back Breece Hall to deliver them a victory this Christmas Eve, and deliver he did, as the Jets ended up beating the Washington Commanders 30-28. The Washington Commanders very nearly came back in this game after they benched quarterback Sam Howell, who up until that point was 22 for 56 yards and 2 interceptions. Jacoby Brissett led the offense on 3 subsequent touchdown drives. Um, he was 10 for 13 for 100 yards and a touchdown. I can't really help but think that the Sam Howell era in Washington is over after these bad couple games, which is a bit strange to say. He was really good for most of the season, but that's just the nature of the NFL. Chris Rodriguez filling in for the injured Brian Robinson had 58 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground. Antonio Gibson, 30 yards and a touchdown. Terry McLaurin, 3 receptions, 50 yards. Logan Thomas, 5 for 36 and a score. The defense had an interception, but Washington's comeback bid ultimately did not finalize itself. This team now finds itself with a likely top 5 pick in the draft and looking at a potential quarterback controversy going into 2024. It's going to be very interesting to see what they do there. New York Jets, meanwhile, are now 6-9 after this victory. Trevor Siemian did enough to lead the Jets to a win, 217 yards, a touchdown, and interception in the air. But as I mentioned earlier, it was at the Breece Hall show. He had 20 carries for 95 yards and 2 touchdowns, 12 receptions on 16 targets for 96 yards. Absolute dominance from him. Hopefully, he carries that into next week when the Jets play a very tough Browns team Thursday night. Garrett Wilson, 9 receptions, 76 yards. Tyler Conklin, 4 for 35 at the tight end position. The defense, 2 interceptions, a sack, a blocked field goal. This felt like a trap game for the Jets. It started to look like it was going to be, but eventually the team did rally. They ended up winning. And hey, over these final 2 games, they could build much needed momentum going into next year when they get Aaron Rodgers back and hopefully look to compete for the playoffs once more. The Seattle Seahawks moved into the final NFC wildcard spot with a 20-17 comeback victory over the Tennessee Titans this past Sunday. Quarterback Geno Smith came back from injury this week. He threw for 227 yards and 2 touchdowns in this game, leading the offense relatively efficiently down the field. And of course, in the fourth quarter, leading a comeback for Seattle. Kenneth Walker had a relatively disappointing outing following his big game against Philadelphia. 16 carries for 54 yards for him on the day. Tyler Lockett, 8 receptions for 81 yards. DK Metcalf, 4 for 56 and a touchdown. Jackson Smith Najigba, starting to really come into his own now on this offense, had 6 receptions for 61. The defense, 6 sacks on the day. Just a really, really complete game by Seattle. They were able to put everything together at the end. And that is why they are now the final wildcard team in the NFC, sitting at 8-7. For the Titans, they fall to 5-10. Quarterback Ryan Tannehill had 152 yards through the air. Derrick Henry had a 12-yard passing touchdown, 88 yards and a touchdown on the ground, and a reception for 11 yards. He was great, showing some signs that maybe the old Derrick Henry might still be there. Treylon Burks, 2 receptions, 25 yards. DeAndre Hopkins, 2 for 20. Okonkwo, though, led the receiving core of this Titans offense at the tight end position. 6 receptions, 63 yards, and a touchdown for him. The defense, 6 sacks. Ultimately, though, not enough for Tennessee. They are clearly looking towards 2024. If you look at some of the comments by some of the older players after the game, they can see the shift. They're starting to look around at potential teams they can join either via free agency or trade. And yeah, we're seeing a shift in the Tennessee Titans right now. I expect that 2024 they might continue to struggle for a little bit, but it's going to be interesting to see what Coach Vrabel and this team's vision is going into next year and for the future. The afternoon kicked off with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers taking firm control of the NFC South in a 30-12 rout of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Tampa Bay, now 8-7, is in first place in the NFC South. And with their final two games against the Saints and the Panthers, could potentially look to wrap up the division over the next couple weeks, guarantee themselves a playoff home game. Baker Mayfield continues his fantastic play, 283 yards and two touchdowns. The team has expressed interest in him returning next season. Baker has as well. Going to be interesting to see what happens there and if they're able to hammer a contract out. Running back Rashad White, 39 yards and a touchdown on the ground, 6 receptions, 38 through the air. Mike Evans continues his Hall of Fame level play, 7 receptions, 86 yards, 2 touchdowns. Chris Godwin added in 6 receptions for 78 yards as well. The defense had 2 interceptions, 4 sacks. They pretty much just bullied the Jaguars all day long. They recovered 2 fumbles as well. Just Tampa looks to be a really, really good team right now. And if they're able to play like they have been over the past couple weeks for the remainder of the season and into the playoffs, they could be a very dangerous opponent for someone to face. The Jaguars, meanwhile, fall to 8-7, and by virtue of tiebreakers, they are still technically in first place of the AFC South, though that is now at risk with the Texans and the Colts right there with them. The Jaguars, though, do get the Panthers next week and finish with the Titans. So if I had to bet on it, I would say Jacksonville is still likely going to win this division, but anything can happen. Trevor Lawrence struggled. He had 211 yards, a touchdown, and 2 interceptions. But more importantly for the Jaguars, he has a shoulder injury now. CJ Beathard filling in 4 yards and a touchdown. It's going to be very interesting to see who starts next week based on the injuries. Travis Etienne continues his struggles as well. 12 yards on 6 carries, 3 receptions for 19 yards as well. Calvin Ridley had a good game though. 6 receptions for 90 yards and 2 touchdowns. Evan Ingram, 10 receptions for 95 yards. The defense, only 2 sacks. It's got to be frustrating if you're a Jaguars fan to see this team, which had such a promising start, falter down the stretch like this. Now the playoffs are at risk, the division is at risk. And regardless of what happens come 2024, some major changes clearly are needed for this team moving forward. And I expect the Jacksonville Jaguars to shake some things up in an effort to get back to a little bit more of a dominant level of play next year. The Chicago Bears continue to have their cake and eat it too as they won again this week to the Arizona Cardinals 27-16. Yet, because they have the Carolina Panthers draft pick, still hold the number one pick in the draft. Chicago saw a good performance by Justin Fields after his off day last week. 15 for 27 for 170 yards and a touchdown for him in the air. He did have an interception as well, but he had 97 yards and a touchdown on the ground. Khalil Herbert, 112 yards and a touchdown on the ground for him on 20 carries. The defense was able to get consistent pressure on quarterback Kyler Murray in the offense all day long, resulting in 2 sacks. But not everything was perfect for Chicago. DJ Moore now has an ankle injury. He's questionable for next week. He had 3 receptions for 18 yards in this one. And though he was able to finish the game, obviously it affected him. Cole Kmet had a standout performance at the tight end position, 4 receptions for 107 yards, but he has a knee injury. He's also questionable for next week, though the initial diagnosis is promising. Still, if you're Chicago, you have to be happy with where you're at. The team is starting to show signs of improvement. You have the number one overall pick, and the future looks incredibly bright for you. For the Cardinals, this is a culture building season. We weren't expecting them to get a lot of wins, but still, they were relatively in this game towards the end. Kyler Murray, 230 yards, 2 touchdowns in the air. It's going to be very interesting to see what the Cardinals do with him moving forward going into next year, if they draft his replacement or if they keep him as the guy for another season. James Conner had a pretty good game, 45 yards on the ground, 5 receptions, 67 yards, and a touchdown in the air. Greg Dortch had 245 yards and a touchdown. Ray McBride, 6 receptions for 31 yards. The defense interception, sack. But ultimately, Arizona is not as talented as Chicago. They weren't expected to win this game. So the fact that they were able to stay somewhat competitive in this is perhaps a sign of good things to come next year. The battle of two teams which have been unable to beat opponents with winning records, yet have great records themselves. It was the Miami Dolphins who ended up on top of this game. Dallas and Miami had a back and forth, exciting affair all game long, but Miami won it on a last second field goal from Jason Sanders. And as a result, Miami moves to 11-4. Tua, 293 yards and a touchdown. Raheem Mostert, 46 yards on the ground. He added a receiving touchdown. Tyreek Hill, 9 receptions, 99 yards. Jalen Waddle, single reception for 50 yards, and he has a high ankle sprain as well, so not a great day for him. As I mentioned, Jason Sanders had a fantastic day, picking, hitting the game winner. Miami Dolphins defense, 4 sacks. And look, Miami is now in neck and neck with Baltimore for the number one seed. They play next week. That game is going to be huge. If they win against Baltimore, then suddenly it's Miami who's the number one seed and controls their destiny for the AFC playoffs. But if they lose, Buffalo comes to town, and with Buffalo playing New England, that Week 18 clash could potentially be for the AFC East. So basically, what I'm saying is that Miami still has a ton to play for in the next 2 weeks. For Dallas, they fall to 10-5, and because the Eagles ended up beating the Giants on Christmas Day, are now slated to play in the wild card round against a suddenly surging Tampa Bay Buccaneers team. Dak, 253 yards and 2 touchdowns on the day. Tony Pollard struggled on the ground, 38 yards on 12 carries. CeeDee Lamb, 6 receptions, 118 yards, and a touchdown. Jake Ferguson, 4 receptions for 45 yards. The defense, only a single sack. The story for this Cowboys team is clear. They are able to beat bad teams, they're able to compete with good teams, but ultimately they are unable to beat good teams, at least for the most part. If they want to change that narrative and turn things around and really make something of this season, they're going to have to change that. And they will have a chance to change that as they get a Detroit Lions team looking to potentially stay in the hunt for the number one seed next week. Sunday night brought much joy to the greater Boston and New England area and much sorrow to the greater Denver area as the New England Patriots beat the Denver Broncos on Christmas Eve 26-23. New England, suddenly winner of 2 of their last 3 games, has a chance to build some real positive momentum here to end the season as they take on 2 division rivals in Buffalo and New York to end the year. Bailey Zappi has played decent football since starting for this Patriots team. 256 yards and 2 touchdowns through the air in this game. Zeke, 27 yards on 12 carries, 9 receptions for 33 yards and a touchdown for him. Demario Douglas, 5 receptions, 74 yards. Devontae Parker, 4 receptions, 65 yards. Mike Gesicki, 2 receptions, 15 yards, and a touchdown, filling in for the injured Hunter Henry. The defense, 5 sacks, as well as a touchdown and a fumble recovery. And hey, this Patriots team still showing a lot of fight, still coached by the greatest coaching mind of all time in the NFL. And I wouldn't be too surprised if they continue to make noise and compete throughout the rest of the season. For Denver, meanwhile, their playoff hopes are on life support as they fall to 7-8 in a tough AFC. Russell Wilson threw for 238 yards, 2 touchdowns, but for the most part, he looked a little out of sorts. Javonte Williams, 24 yards and a touchdown on the ground. He was not efficient. The Patriots shut him down as really no one of note for this Broncos team. Cortland Sutton suffered a concussion. He wasn't able to do anything in the game. The defense only had 2 sacks. And the Broncos just can't play like this if they want to still have any hopes of making the playoffs. They play the Chargers and a suddenly resurgent Raiders team. 2 divisional games, always going to be tough. And if Denver has any hopes of salvaging the season, they are going to have to really turn it around starting next week against LA. The 3 games that the NFL gifted to fans on Christmas Day kicked off with a classic divisional matchup between the Kansas City Chiefs and the Las Vegas Raiders. Up until this point, it had been nearly 4 years since the Raiders had beaten Kansas City, and Kansas City coming into the game needed to win this one. So, of course, it was the Raiders who ended up coming away with a 20-14 win. And this was pretty much because of the Raiders' defense. Another 2 defensive touchdowns, an interception, fumble recovery, 4 sacks. The unit was just dominant all day long. It stifled anything Kansas City tried to do. Aiden O'Connell, the quarterback, was only 9 for 21 for 62 yards. Zamir White, though, on the ground, 145 yards. Really, just this was the Raiders' defense just taking care of business, winning this game for the team. And now the Raiders at 7-8 could potentially win the AFC West and still make the playoffs as a wild card team if things break right. Their season's not done yet, and things are really getting interesting now for them. With upcoming games against the Colts and the Broncos, though, they're going to really need to bring their A game if they want to have a chance at making the playoffs at the end of the year. The Chiefs, meanwhile, fall to 9-6 and now are in jeopardy of losing to the division to the Raiders if they lose out and if Vegas wins out. Mahomes did not have a good game. 235 yards, a touchdown, and an interception. That interception, of course, was taken back for a pick six. He added 53 yards on the ground, but it's now become a trend this season where we've said Mahomes has had a bad game and he hasn't been able to do enough with the players around him. And through his fault or not, as the quarterback of the Kansas City Chiefs, it's his job to win them games. And lately they haven't been doing that. Isaiah Pacheco coming back from his shoulder injury had 26 yards and a touchdown on the ground, 4 receptions as well, but was not able to get any yards on that. He unfortunately left though with a nasty looking concussion. Hopefully he's able to recover. Travis Kelce, 5 receptions, 44 yards. This Chiefs team just has been really disappointing lately. They really need to step it up here. And if they don't, they're at risk of losing the division. That being said, Kansas City still has a top 5 defense, which had 2 sacks on the day and only allowed 62 passing yards. And with an upcoming schedule against the floundering Cincinnati Bengals and the Los Angeles Chargers, Kansas City could still very well win the AFC West and secure their spot in the playoffs this year. Still, not exactly comfortable situation to be in if you're a Chiefs fan. Speaking of being a fan that's uncomfortable of where your team is at right now, let's talk about the Eagles. who ended up beating the New York Giants 33-25 in the second Christmas game. Philadelphia is back in first place in the NFC East. I project them to win this division with upcoming games against the Cardinals and the same Giants, but you never know. The offense has been struggling. The team vibes are off. You could see Devonta Smith and some of the other players arguing with Coach Sirianni towards the end of the game. Something's wrong with the Eagles. Let's talk about the players, though, real quick. Jalen Hurts, 301 yards and a touchdown in the air, 34 yards and a touchdown on the ground. DeAndre Swift, 92 yards and a touchdown on the ground. Smith, 4 receptions, 79 yards and a touchdown. A.J. Brown, 6 receptions, 80 yards. He was out for a little bit, but he came back. Something to monitor. He could be hurt. Dallas Goedert, 7 receptions, 71 yards. Defense had an interception. They had a sack. They had a fumble. Something feels off with this team. I know the stats show that they dominated the Giants. The Giants were only able to really come back late, but the fact that the Giants were in this game at all kind of just tells you where this Eagles team is at right now. And yeah, Philadelphia's probably going to win the division, and they're probably going to make the playoffs, and they might even win a playoff game. But considering where the team expectations were going into the season, and considering how the team is playing right now, I can't say that this team is anything but disappointing, and that they really need to shape things up going into the playoffs. Giants fall to 5-10. Tommy DeVito has been benched. It seems like the Tommy DeVito experiment is over. Before he was benched, he was 9 for 16 for 55 yards. Tyrod Taylor coming in had 133 yards and a touchdown, as well as an interception. Saquon Barkley, 80 yards and a touchdown, as well as a 2-point conversion on the ground. 3 receptions, only 4 yards in the air. Darius Slayton, 3 receptions, 90 yards, and a touchdown in the air as well. The defense, interception, a sack. They had pick six, fumble recovery. Just, it's interesting to see where the Giants are at. The defense has been playing great as of late. The offense has not. Whereas earlier in the season, the offense was shouldering a little bit more of the burden. And it just feels like the Giants haven't been able to put together a complete game this year. Going into 2024, obviously, they're going to have to do a number of things to address the holes on this roster. But I also expect the Giants to start to build a little bit off the momentum they've gotten later this year, particularly on defense, so that come next year, they will be ready to come and compete for the NFC East and to compete for the playoffs. The final game of this week's slate was perhaps the most anticipated game of the season, as the top seeded Baltimore Ravens took on the top seeded San Francisco 49ers in what could have been a Super Bowl preview. But for one of these teams, however, it was an absolute nightmare as the San Francisco 49ers lost 33-19. Let's talk about San Francisco real quick. Actually, most of their skill position players had relatively good days. Christian McCaffrey, 103 yards and a touchdown on the ground. 6 receptions, 28 yards. Brandon Ayuk, 6 receptions, 113 yards. George Kittle, 7 receptions, 126 yards. Debo, though, had an off day, 4 receptions for 47 yards. The defense did have a safety, also had 2 sacks. I really was not able to stop Lamar or the Ravens offense. And the quarterbacks struggled a lot. Brock Purdy, 4 interceptions and an injury. Sam Darnold, a touchdown and an interception. Just a terrible game for the San Francisco 49ers. Now they are potentially at risk of losing the number 1 seed to either the Lions or the Eagles. They do play Washington next week, so I expect the Niners to win that game. But then they get a very frisky Rams team. So if they slip there, San Francisco suddenly could find themselves playing wild card weekend, which would be disastrous considering where this team was looking to head just a week ago. For Baltimore, they prove, at least for this week, that they're the best team in the NFL. Lamar, 252 yards and 2 touchdowns. as well as 45 on the ground. He is likely going to be the NFL MVP this year. He deserves it. He's been great. Gus Edwards, 31 yards and a touchdown on the ground. Also had a big 39-yard reception. Look to see him more involved next week and moving forward as this team prepares for the playoffs. Zay Flowers, 9 receptions, 72 yards and a touchdown. Good to see him bounce back after his poor performance last week. Isaiah Likely, 3 receptions, 56 yards at the tight end position. The defense, 5 interceptions, 4 sacks. Just a dominant performance by them. And with Baltimore playing the Dolphins and the Steelers, they could potentially lose out on the AFC North and the number one seed. But at this point, I have faith in them. They've shown that they can do it against any opponent. And I wouldn't be too surprised if we're talking about Baltimore finishing the year 14-3 with the number one seed in the AFC and as the Super Bowl favorite moving forward. Thank you so much for watching this week's NFL breakdown. If you liked what you saw, please leave a like on the video, comment, subscribe to the channel, and we will catch you in the next one.